A widow's mantilla hides more than grief. Within its lace lies a deadly secret. Welcome to the Mysterious Casebook. I am your host, Leo. Tell me, where in the world are you listening from today? Your comments make this channel come alive. I treasure everyone. Let's begin. The sky over Lower Chiddingfold was a pale forget-me-not blue, gently veiled by trailing white clouds. It was the sort of afternoon that seemed to beg for jam tarts, garden chairs, and conversations about roses, and it got precisely that. In the vicarage garden, under a neatly erected awning, Miss Harriet Pym's Thursday afternoon tea was in full swing. The local ladies, all in pastels and florals, had gathered with the quiet satisfaction that only sponge cake and shared opinion could summon. Miss Marple sat near the hydrangeas, her grey-blue eyes taking in everything while her knitting needles clicked in polite rhythm. To the untrained eye she might have appeared only mildly attentive to the topic at hand, which happened to be Mrs. Sutcliffe's overzealous begonias. But in truth, she was keeping careful note of who looked at whom and how long they held. The gaze. Of course, the Spanish are terribly dramatic, said Mrs. Rosalind Edgewater, her pearls clinking softly as she sipped tea. Have you seen her veil? That black lace thing. It's practically mourning attire. She is a widow. Dear, murmured Miss Lavinia Crane with a slight frown. Her husband died last year quite suddenly. Yes, but that mantilla. Rosalind lowered her voice as she leaned toward the others. More suited to a flamenco than a funeral. It's rather theatrical. Miss Marple raised her head, ever so slightly. She had not yet spoken, but her fingers paused mid-row. The object of their scrutiny was Señora Isabella de la Fuente, who had arrived in Lower Chiddingfold scarcely 3 weeks prior. She had taken residence in Briar Cottage, a picturesque but long unoccupied home that had belonged to Colonel Marchbanks. Rumour had it that the Colonel, who had passed away 5 years earlier, had met her during his service in Gibraltar, and left her the cottage in his will. The entire matter was faintly scandalous, but the villagers, though curious, had received her with a polite wariness. Isabella was tall, graceful, and widow-black. Her mantilla, the subject of endless speculation, framed her pale face like a theatrical curtain. She was seated alone, slightly apart from the rest, looking serenely over the lawn with an unreadable expression. Perhaps she is simply very traditional, Miss Marple said gently, not looking up from her knitting. And one should not be too hasty in judging customs we don't understand. Rosalind raised her eyebrows, but said nothing further. It was only 15 minutes later, as the tea was cooling and the plates had been scraped clean of ginger biscuits, that the peace of the gathering was shattered. A sharp cry rang out from the French doors of the vicarage. Everyone turned. It was Angela Crowthorne, the vicar's niece, barely 20, who had been helping clear the tea things inside. Her face was pale as porcelain, her hands trembling. "There's someone in the study," she gasped. It's Mrs. Draper. She's dead." Gasps erupted across the garden. Chairs were pushed back, and china clattered as the ladies surged to their feet. Miss Marple, rising more slowly than the others, met Isabella's eyes across the garden. The Spanish woman had not moved. Within minutes, the garden was abuzz with confusion and anxious chatter. Miss Marple unobtrusively made her way through the crowd and into the vicarage. The study door stood open. Reverend Crowthorne himself was standing over the prone form of Mrs. Doris Draper, a local widow of considerable means and even more considerable opinions. Her bonnet lay askew on the floor beside her, and her gloved hand still clutched a small, crushed posy of violets. "She came to speak with me just before tea," the vicar said hoarsely. "I had to leave briefly to take a telephone call. When I returned, she was like this." Dr. Dewberry, summoned promptly, arrived within 10 minutes. After a brief examination, he straightened with a furrowed brow. "She's been poisoned," he said flatly. "Cyanide, unless I'm mistaken. The smell, bitter almonds, quite unmistakable." A hush fell. Only the sound of a clock ticking over the mantel broke the stillness. Miss Marple's expression remained composed. She stepped forward and quietly surveyed the scene. The spilled tea on the corner of the desk, the crushed violets, and the half-filled teacup beside the small sugar bowl. Her eyes flicked briefly to a faint trace of lace, black lace, caught on the brass edge of a chair. "Dear me," she murmured. That evening the police arrived from the county headquarters in Much Benham. Detective Inspector Graves, a man of precise moustaches and a firm belief in motives of passion and profit, took command. He listened with grim focus to the testimonies, catalogued the names of all present, and began questioning the vicar and his niece. Miss Marple stayed silent unless spoken to, yet inside her mind moved like clockwork. Who would wish to kill Mrs. Draper, a woman well known for her sharp tongue but hardly dangerous? Why poison? So theatrical, so certain. And why? Now, on the day of the tea, in the vicarage of all places, the next morning the village of Lower Chiddingfold awoke to the crisp rustle of the Chiddingfold Clarion, its front page already bearing the bold headline, "Widow Dead in Vicarage Murder." Police baffled locals. Stunned. But Miss Marple, seated quietly on her front porch with a fresh cup of tea, had already begun counting things the others had missed. There had been too many violets, too much silence and just enough lace, and she had a suspicion that the mantilla was no mere ornament of grief. By the following morning, Lower Chiddingfold had transformed from a sleepy Hampshire village into a hive of barely contained scandal. The news of Mrs. Draper's death had not only travelled from cottage to cottage with remarkable speed, but had already been embroidered with new layers of speculation. The baker's wife claimed the tea had turned purple just before Mrs. Draper drank it. A boy delivering milk insisted he'd seen someone in black slip through the hedge bordering the vicarage garden, though whether it was a mourning veil or just a tree branch was anyone's guess. In the post office, where gossip was traded as freely as stamps, Miss Lavinia Crane leaned conspiratorially over the counter. Of course, Doris always had her enemies, never one to hold back, poor soul. You remember how she scolded the greengrocer last month about the price of his plums? Behind her, Miss Marple stood with quiet patience, awaiting her parcel of embroidery thread. She had no intention of interrupting, though her ears were keenly attuned. Mrs. Edgewater arrived next, clutching her handbag like it contained state secrets. "Lavinia," she said in an urgent whisper, "you mustn't repeat this, but I heard that Doris had been threatening to change her will. Imagine, at her age—" Lavinia's eyebrows rose nearly to her hat brim. "Change it to whom, I wonder?" "Well, that's the mystery, isn't it?" Miss Marple stepped forward with a faint smile and a soft, "Good morning, ladies." They greeted her with a mixture of politeness and faint suspicion. There was something about Miss Marple that always made people pause. She never asked direct questions, but somehow managed to know everything just the same. By mid-afternoon, The village lanes were filled with whispers. The vicar had cancelled his scripture group. Angela Crowthorne had not been seen since the Morning Post. And most curiously of all, Signora Isabella de la Fuente had taken a solitary walk through the village, mantilla and all, nodding gracefully to passers-by without uttering a word. Miss Marple, seated near her front window with her embroidery, noted the precise angle of Isabella's path and the fact that she paused outside the Draper residence for exactly 12 seconds. Not long enough to knock, but certainly not a casual stroll. At 4 o'clock, Inspector Graves convened a formal interview with those who had attended the tea. The interviews were held in the drawing room of the vicarage, now cold and echoing with absence. A constable stood at the door, his boots squeaking faintly on the rug. Miss Marple was among the first to be summoned. "You were seated where exactly, Miss Marple?" the inspector asked, flipping open a small notepad. "Near the hydrangeas, just at the edge of the shade," she said, her voice gentle and steady. "From that angle, I had a clear view of the tea table and of most of the guests, except perhaps for the vicar when he stepped inside. Did you see anyone add anything to Mrs. Draper's cup?" "No, but I did notice she chose the second cup from the right after a small hesitation." The inspector frowned. "Hesitation?" "She reached for the third cup, but stopped, then took the second." "Could someone have arranged the cups beforehand?" "It's possible," Miss Marple said, "though more interesting is why she changed her mind." The inspector scribbled something, but his gaze was already moving toward the door. "Thank you, Miss Marple." "That'll be all for now." She left the room slowly, passing Signora de la Fuente in the hallway. The widow gave a faint nod, her expression unreadable. By dusk, 5 others had been questioned: the vicar, Angela, Mrs. Edgewater, Lavinia Crane, and Mr. Weatherby, the local solicitor who had dropped by to return a book and had remained for cake. Graves was frustrated. No one had seen anything. No one admitted to speaking with Mrs. Draper beyond pleasantries, and no one had a clear motive, except that nearly everyone in the room had some grievance with her, large or small. She had insulted Mr. Weatherby's wife's embroidery. She had once accused Lavinia of hoarding jam. She had opposed Angela's engagement to the schoolmaster. All minor slights until one became deadly. The following morning, Miss Marple visited her niece, who lived just off the high street. "You know, Aunt Jane," said Joan, stirring tea with uncharacteristic vigour, "this whole affair has everyone on edge. Poor Angela is refusing to come out of her room." "She was very close to Mrs. Draper?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Not exactly, but I think she looked up to her, at least before she began interfering in her relationship. Angela's quite sure Mrs. Draper was writing to the schoolmaster behind her back." Miss Marple looked out the window, where the garden was beginning to droop in the summer heat. "People sometimes disguise interference as concern. It can feel the same to the recipient, but the intent is what matters." Joan blinked. "Do you think that's what this is? A matter of intent?" "I think," said Miss Marple, rising with care, "that someone in this village meant for Mrs. Draper to drink that tea. The rest is a matter of observation. She left soon after, walking at a gentle pace through the heart of the village. She passed the Draper residence, where thick curtains were now drawn over every window. She nodded to young Mr. Fellows, who delivered bread and seemed unusually skittish. She paused outside Briar Cottage. The curtains were open. Miss Marple did not knock. Instead, she studied the edges of the window-sill, where a faint smudge of violet pigment clung to the old stone. Later that evening she sat in her parlour, knitting motionless in her lap. Something was not quite fitting. There was the mantilla, of course, the trace of lace left on the vicar's chair, but also the violets. Mrs. Draper always wore violets, yet the ones in her hand had not come from her own garden. They were a deeper shade, more foreign, more dramatic. Spanish violets. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, letting the pattern settle in her mind like a tapestry turned face up. There would be more to learn, more to unravel. The past had begun to stir, and Miss Marple was listening. The heat in Lower Chiddingfold lingered through the weekend, a breathless, pressing warmth that made tempers short and secrets sweat just beneath the surface. Yet while the flowers drooped and the air sat heavy over the rooftops, Miss Marple was anything but idle. Her steps were unhurried, her visits discreet, and her observations tucked away behind a mild smile and knitting bag. On Monday morning, she walked to the village churchyard under the pretence of tending to the grave of her late cousin Ruth, who had once summered in Chiddingfold and was now buried beneath a modest rose-covered stone. But Miss Marple's attention was not on the rose bush. It was drawn toward the far edge of the path, where the vicar, Reverend Crowthorne, stood near the gate, speaking quietly with none other than Señora Isabella de la Fuente. The widow, as ever, was composed. Her black mantilla fluttered ever so, slightly in the breeze, a ripple of shadow against the sunlit stones. She gestured once, her gloved hand lifting gracefully, and the vicar responded with a solemn nod. When they parted, Isabella walked away toward Briar Cottage without once looking back. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves, waited a discreet moment, and approached the vicar. "Such a warm morning for visiting graves," she said kindly. He startled slightly, but managed a smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, yes indeed, Miss Marple." Though it seems some conversations are best had among the quiet. "I imagine Señora de la Fuente is quite shaken," she said gently. "Mrs. Draper's death being so sudden and so dramatic." The vicar's eyes drifted toward the chapel. "Yes? She's unsettled, I think, though she didn't say it directly. She asked after the funeral arrangements, said she felt it was her duty to attend." "Ah, duty," Miss Marple repeated softly. "One wonders what binds her to Mrs. Draper so strongly. They had not known each other long, had they?" "Only a few weeks by my count," said the vicar, frowning faintly. "Though Mrs. Draper did pay her a visit or two, I recall Isabella mentioning it at tea. Something about Spanish needlework, I believe. Draper was very proud of her lace collection." "Yes," Miss Marple mused. "She did. Enjoy fine things. It's said she once outbid Lady Ashcombe for an entire trunk of Valenciennes lace." The vicar chuckled faintly, then caught himself. "Forgive me. It's odd how small things still raise a smile even now. Memory is a patchwork, Reverend. Some squares are darker than others." She left him then, her mind already circling. The thought, why would a woman like Isabella, so dignified and reserved, concern herself with another woman's funeral, unless something deeper bound them? Duty, yes, but not affection. Miss Marple had not once seen them speak warmly together. Something else lingered between them. Perhaps debt, perhaps fear. By midday, Inspector Graves returned to the village, this time accompanied by Sergeant Little. They made the rounds once again, pressing for new details. They questioned Angela Crowthorne more aggressively now, noting the tremor in her voice and the tearful contradiction in her answers. "I only brought in the tray," she repeated. "It was all laid out already by the time I returned from fetching. The marmalade, I didn't see who touched the cups." "Are you certain?" Graves asked. Angela's fingers twisted in her lap. "Quite certain. I may have bumped the table, but the cups were all still full." Miss Marple, seated beside Joan for moral support, said nothing, but she noted how Angela's hand went instinctively to the chain at her neck, where once a small gold locket had hung. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the Draper residence. The housekeeper, Mrs. Betts, was a stout woman with a fierce bun and little time for nonsense. But she respected Miss Marple, and after a brief nod allowed her inside. "I only came to return Mrs. Draper's knitting," Miss Marple explained gently, holding out a small basket. "She left it at the vicarage garden. Such lovely work." Mrs. Betts sighed. She was proud of that piece. Said she'd enter it in the Women's Guild this autumn. "I believe she might have won," Miss Marple replied with warmth. "Would you mind if I sat a moment? The sun's quite strong. Today." They sat in the drawing-room. The air was heavy with lavender sachets and silence. "She wasn't an easy woman, miss," Mrs. Betts said eventually. "Sharp as vinegar, especially if something wasn't just so. But she was fair. Paid. On time, never shouted. Did she have many callers lately?" "Mostly women from the guild. That fancy Spanish lady came once or twice. Once brought some biscuits, strange ones. Mrs. Draper didn't like them. Said they tasted like burnt almonds." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Burnt? Almonds, you say? How curious." Mrs. Betts stood. "Can I get you some tea, Miss Marple?" "No, thank you, dear. I must be off, but you've been most kind." As she left the Draper residence, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of reflection. The lace, the biscuits, the violets. Each detail, on its own, was inconclusive, but like strands of thread in her embroidery basket, they were beginning to weave a pattern, and there was one more thread she needed. She walked directly to the small antiques shop near the green, Hollingworth and Sons, known for dusty corners and forgotten treasures. It was where Mrs. Draper had often boasted of finding her best pieces. Inside, the bell chimed, and Mr. Hollingworth himself emerged from behind a stack of porcelain. "Ah, Miss Marple, always a pleasure. I wonder," she said, drawing her voice into the most innocent tones, "if Mrs. Draper had been in recently? I heard she was inquiring after Spanish lace." He nodded. "Oh yes, just last week, in fact. I had a few pieces she was interested in, claimed she had an eye for authenticity, said her new neighbour had the real thing, and she wanted to compare." "Her? A new neighbour being Señora de la Fuente?" "That's right. Did she purchase anything?" No, but she left quite ruffled. Said the stitching on mine was too clean to be antique. Took one of my catalogues, though." Miss Marple thanked him and left, walking slowly back toward her cottage, the bells of St. Winifred's tolling the half-hour. There was tension in the air now, like the pause before a thunderclap. The villagers whispered and pointed more openly. Some cast glances toward Briar Cottage with narrowed eyes. Others spoke of Spanish poisons and old rivalries. But Miss Marple's gaze was calm, for in her quiet mind the storm had already begun to stir. One woman had died holding violets. Another wore mourning like a stage costume, and someone close to them both had rearranged the cups. The truth was there. It always was. You simply had to look for the lace. Tuesday morning arrived in Lower Chiddingfold, with a low mist curling along the lanes, softening the outlines of the cottages and hedgerows. The kind of mist that concealed more than it revealed, which, Miss Marple reflected, seemed rather fitting. The village was restless. Rumours thickened like clotted cream, and every face at the greengrocer's or the post office seemed to wear a question. Who would want Doris Draper dead? And more daring still, who among them might have done it? Inspector Graves returned just after breakfast, his temper already showing signs of fray. He had made no arrest, yet pressure from county headquarters had intensified. Cyanide, a poison both deadly and dramatic, pointed to premeditation. It was not something one stumbled upon. It had to be obtained with purpose, and that, he declared to Sergeant Little as they walked the length of Church Lane, meant motive mattered more than ever. By mid-morning, the first real suspect emerged, or, rather, was seized upon Angela Crowthorne. The vicar's niece had been the last person near the tea tray before the fatal cup was passed to Mrs. Draper. Her movements, according to Graves's notes, were vague. She had retrieved the marmalade, returned to the garden, and then left again shortly before the scream. That gap, those minutes, had become the inspector's obsession. He confronted her outside the vicarage in full view of the lane. "Miss Crowthorne," he said, his voice clipped. "You claim the tea was untouched when you returned?" Angela's cheeks flushed. "Yes, or I think so. I wasn't paying close attention. I simply set down the marmalade and went back inside." "Why did you leave again? To fetch napkins?" There were already napkins laid out. Angela looked stricken. "Then I must have forgotten. I just—" "You were alone in the house?" "Yes." "Miss Crowthorne," the inspector said firmly, "you do understand the seriousness of this matter. Mrs. Draper's death was no accident, and cyanide does not find its way into teacups by chance." Angela's eyes brimmed with tears, but she nodded. "I know." Behind the hedge, Miss Marple stood quite still, shielded by a spray of climbing clematis. She had not meant to overhear, but the inspector's tone had carried. When Angela turned, away walking back up the vicarage steps with her head down, Miss Marple noted the faint imprint of something sharp behind the girl's eyes. Not guilt, but pain, perhaps shame. That afternoon the second suspect made herself known without intending to. Miss Lavinia Crane, in a moment of uncharacteristic nervousness, had spoken too freely at the dressmaker's. "Well, I suppose if I had been in Angela's position, I would have done it too," she said, tugging at her sleeve. "Doris had no business interfering with that poor girl's engagement. Young love ought to be protected, especially when it's so fragile." The dressmaker, Mrs. Dilks, a known parrot of village news, relayed the comment faithfully to her. Next 3 clients, and sent it floating through the village by tea time. Miss Marple, upon hearing it from her niece Joan, took a long moment before responding. Lavinia does love to dramatize. Still, there's often a flicker of truth in what one says when one thinks no one is listening. But surely you don't believe Lavinia capable of murder? Not directly, no, Miss Marple said, folding her hands. But I wonder if someone else might have taken her sentiments quite literally. She rose, her steps measured, and walked to the small writing desk by the window. From its drawer she withdrew a notebook, one she used for embroidery patterns but had lately employed for something rather different. In it she had begun to trace connections. Who had been where, who had spoken to whom, and which stories had begun to shift under scrutiny. One page she had marked with 3 names: Angela, Lavinia, and Señora de la Fuente. Beneath each she had written a word, for Angela vulnerable, for Lavinia talkative, for Isabella unknown. It was the last that troubled her most. The Spanish widow was still a cipher. Elegant, poised, and unfailingly polite, she had spoken no ill of the deceased, nor tried to deflect attention, but she had brought those almond-scented biscuits, and she had visited the Draper house, and she wore lace that caught on furniture. That evening Miss Marple attended the Women's Guild meeting at the village hall. It had been moved to a smaller side room, out of respect for Mrs. Draper, who had once been its vice-chair. The turnout was modest. There were murmurs at the tea-table, hesitations at the sugar bowl. Señora de la Fuente was present, seated quietly with a book of embroidery in her lap. Miss Marple took the chair beside her. "Such fine thread," she remarked, peering at the work. "Is it Spanish?" Isabella smiled faintly. "Yes, from Cadiz. My grandmother taught me to use only what is passed down. The modern thread, it breaks." "How true," Miss Marple said. "So much stronger when woven from history." They sat in silence for a few moments. Miss Marple noted the steadiness of the woman's hands, the slight roughness along her fingertips. A woman who had worked with thread for decades. "Such a shame about Mrs. Draper," Miss Marple continued, her tone casual. "Did you know her well?" "Not well. She visited once or twice, asked many questions about my lace. Wanted to see the older pieces. She was very particular about lace, had an eye for true craftsmanship." Isabella looked up. She did not believe my lace was real. "No?" She said the pattern was too intricate to have been made by hand, that it must have been machine-stitched. And was it? No, it was my grandmother's work. But Mrs. Draper did not believe me. Miss Marple tilted her head. That must have stung, being called a fraud. The widow's expression did not change, but something tightened behind her eyes. "People often do not understand what they cannot make themselves," she said simply. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the tablecloth. Later that night, in her sitting room with only the tick of the clock for company, Miss Marple thought back to Isabella's voice, smooth, measured, controlled. And still she could not decide whether it was pride or pain that had coloured it. A first suspect had emerged, then a second, and now perhaps a third. But suspicion was not proof. And Miss Marple, unlike Inspector Graves, did not trust haste. She would wait, watch, listen. Sooner or later, someone would speak too freely or move too quickly, and when they did, she would be ready. Wednesday arrived with a light drizzle that clung to the panes like breath on glass, softening the outlines of the village and blurring the borders between truth and illusion. In Lower Chiddingfold, the news that no arrests had been made in the matter of Mrs. Draper's sudden and violent death was beginning to ferment into something more potent than gossip, unease. The police had fallen quiet. Inspector Graves had reportedly left for a meeting at county headquarters. In his absence, Sergeant Little made a half-hearted round of the lanes, asking a few more questions, with a pencil tucked behind his ear and a look of general confusion on his face. No one was surprised when nothing came of it, but Miss Marple was not idle. Shortly after her breakfast, black tea, a lightly buttered scone, and a poached egg, she stepped out into the mist with her mackintosh buttoned and her umbrella tucked under her arm. Her path took her to Briar Cottage, though not directly. She took the longer route along the back lanes, passing the churchyard and a narrow footpath shaded by hawthorn trees. By the time she reached the cottage gate, the drizzle had lightened, and the sky had begun to lift in sallow shades of grey and blue. Senora de la Fuente herself opened the door. "Miss Marple," she said, surprised but not displeased. "You are very punctual. I had not expected visitors. I do apologize for the intrusion," said Miss Marple warmly, "but I happened upon something that may belong to you." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a tiny folded handkerchief, delicate and monogrammed with a faint scent of lavender. "I found this near the vicarage on Monday, just beneath the chair where you had been sitting. It struck me as quite lovely." The Spanish widow accepted it with care. "It is mine, yes, thank you. I had not noticed it missing." Miss Marple tilted her head ever so slightly. "Linen lace edging, I believe. Quite rare in this part of England." Isabella smiled faintly. "It was my mother's." "Then I'm very glad it is returned to you." She paused. "Might I come in for a moment? I feel I've walked too briskly for my age." Isabella stepped aside, and Miss Marple entered the cottage. Briar Cottage had been redecorated since the Colonel's day. Gone were the mahogany cabinets and stiff leather armchairs. In their place were embroidered cushions, polished dark wood furniture, and delicate pottery in cobalt and ivory hues. A fire smouldered gently in the hearth, giving the room a comfort that was both old and foreign. Isabella offered tea. Miss Marple accepted. "I've always admired this house," she said as she sipped. "Colonel Marchbanks was a dear friend. Of my cousins. I remember coming here once for croquet. The lawn was terribly uneven. He spoke of it often," Isabella said. "He was a generous man. He helped my family after the war." "Quite generous, yes." Miss Marple looked out the window toward the side garden. "I imagine Mrs. Draper was very curious about your arrangement here." There was a pause. Then, "Yes, she asked questions, many questions. She often did. A trait some found charming, others rather intolerable." "Did she question the Colonel's will?" A flicker passed across Isabella's face, as if a draught had touched her. "She mentioned it, said she had known the Colonel for years and found it unusual." "Unusual that he left Briar Cottage to a foreign lady," Miss Marple said gently. Isabella nodded. "I told her there was nothing hidden. My mother was his nurse during the last months of his life. They formed a friendship. He visited us more. Then once after the war, he wanted to leave us something." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Did she believe you?" "I don't know," Isabella said. "But she left in a fury. Accused me of flattery and manipulation. Said she had proof the will had been amended under pressure." "Proof?" Isabella shook her head. "I never saw it. I assumed she was bluffing. But then—" She returned a second time. Miss Marple's knitting fingers tingled at the words. "Indeed?" "Yes." 2 days before her death. She said she'd found something in her old papers. A letter, I think. She waved it about, then changed her mind and left without showing it. "And you haven't seen it since?" "No." Her voice was firm. "Nor do I know what became of—" Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt. "Well, perhaps it will come to light." As she stepped out into the thinning mist, she noted something near the hedge. A set of footprints, shallow, fading now, but distinctly small and narrow. A woman's shoes, not fresh but recent enough to mark a second visit. Miss Marple made no comment, but tucked the information into the corner of her thoughts. That afternoon, she paid a visit to Joan, bringing a tin of ginger biscuits as pretext. "I do believe," she said, "that Mrs. Draper had something rather important in her possession just before her death. A letter, likely concerning the inheritance of Briar Cottage. It's possible she was using it as leverage." "Leverage for what?" Joan asked. "To discredit Senora de la Fuente, perhaps even to sway public opinion, or to encourage the vicar to intervene. Doris always believed in moral order, her own version of it at least." Joan blinked. "Do you think someone killed her to stop that letter from surfacing?" Miss Marple tapped a biscuit gently on the edge of her saucer. "I think someone may have believed that whatever she held could damage them, and I think they acted before she had the chance to reveal it. But the letter is still missing, for now." That evening Miss Marple returned to her garden. The air had cooled, the drizzle long gone, and the roses were lifting their heads once more. She knelt beside the lavender and clipped a few stems for drying. As she did, she noticed something lodged between two paving stones, a shred of black thread, no longer than a fingernail, fine and glistening. She picked it up with care. It was lace. The edge was torn, not clean, as if caught or yanked in haste. Not the same weave as the lace on the handkerchief. This was finer, more intricate. She rose and returned inside, setting the fragment on a white saucer to study by lamplight. One thread, one fray, and perhaps, just perhaps, one answer. The sky over Lower Chiddingfold cleared at last on Thursday morning, revealing a pale stretch of blue with only a few high clouds lingering like forgotten thoughts. The air had cooled, the village breathed easier, but the tension remained, no longer loud but settled into the hedgerows and chimneys, as if the old buildings themselves were listening. Miss Marple rose early and took her breakfast in the sunroom, where morning light filtered through the lace curtains. On the saucer near her teacup still lay the shred of lace she had found the previous evening. It was delicate, too fine to be from a handkerchief or household trim. It belonged to a garment. And not just any garment, she believed. It belonged to a mantilla. She tucked the fragment into a paper envelope and placed it between the pages of a gardening almanac on the mantel. It would keep well there, hidden and undisturbed, until it was needed. At 9:30, a knock came. At her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Lavinia Crane, eyes darting behind her, cheeks pink with purpose. "Jane," she whispered, glancing down the lane, "do you have a moment?" "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Come in." Inside, Lavinia, perched on the edge of the settee, twisting her gloves. "I shouldn't be here, but I simply couldn't hold it in any longer." She leaned forward. "It's about Mrs. Draper and Angela." Miss Marple poured tea without comment. Lavinia took a deep breath. "It's not what people think. Angela didn't kill Doris, but she had a reason to want her out of the way." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, encouraging her gently. "Because of the schoolmaster?" "Yes. Doris was going to write a letter to the headmistress at his school, accusing him of improper relations. Can you imagine? It was absurd, of course, but she was determined. She said Angela was too young and he was too ambitious. And Angela knew of this. She found the letter in Doris's handbag last week by accident. She didn't take it, but she read enough to understand what Doris intended. Did she confront her? Lavinia hesitated. She begged her to reconsider. Tried, I think, But Doris said it was for Angela's own good. Miss Marple set down her cup. That must have been devastating. It was, but Angela isn't violent. She's just frightened. She'd never poison someone. Miss Marple gave a small nod. I believe you, Lavinia. Lavinia looked relieved, but her brow furrowed again. There's more. Doris came to see me the day before she died. She was worked up. Said she'd discovered something shocking about Senora de la Fuente. Something to do with lace. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. Lace? She said it was a forgery. Claimed to have found identical machine-made pieces in an old-fashioned catalogue from Paris. She had the page with her, waved it in the air like a banner, said she'd expose Isabella as a fraud. And did you see this page? No. She folded it into her handbag before I could. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And the handbag? Was never found, was it? No, said Miss Marple. Not mentioned in the police report. Lavinia's eyes widened. Then someone took it. Suspect so, said Miss Marple. Thank you, Lavinia. You've been very helpful. Lavinia left shortly after, still glancing over her shoulder. By noon, Miss Marple had donned her coat and taken the path through the woods toward the Draper house. The police had temporarily released the property to the housekeeper, Mrs. Betts, though the parlour and study remained under lock. Mrs. Betts answered with a tired sigh. Back again, Miss Marple? I suppose the village'll never stop talking. Nor should it, Miss Marple said mildly. It's how the truth survives. She asked for a glass of water and was invited into the kitchen. While Mrs. Betts fetched the glass, Miss Marple surveyed the side table where letters and deliveries were usually placed. A stack of old newspapers sat beside a basket of unopened mail and an umbrella stand, and beside that, half hidden by a tea towel, was a small clutch bag in navy leather. Mrs. Betts, she said quietly, might I look at this handbag? The housekeeper frowned. That's not mine. I thought it belonged to Miss Angela. She was here so often. Miss Marple opened the clasp with gentle hands. Inside were a few coins, a folded pair of gloves, and, tucked tightly into the inner pocket, a yellowed scrap torn from a magazine. She unfolded it. It was a catalogued page of lace samples, photographed, and printed with notations in French beneath each pattern. One of them, boxed in blue ink, bore the exact match to the mantilla worn by Senora de la Fuente. The caption read, Las d'Espagne, imitation fabriquée à Lille, 1912. Miss Marple's expression barely changed. She placed the clipping back in the bag, closed the clasp, and handed it to Mrs. Betts. Perhaps you'd better give this to Inspector Graves when he returns. I will, Miss Marple. She left the house and took the long route back through the woods. The trees whispered softly in the breeze, as if urging her forward. That evening she received a visitor. Angela Crowthorne stood at her doorstep, pale but composed. I had to speak with someone, she said quietly. I'm afraid. Miss Marple ushered her in, seated her with tea, and waited. I think I know what happened, Angela whispered. I think Senora de la Fuente came into the house that day, while we were all in the garden. What makes you say that, dear? Saw her just the edge of her mantilla passing through the side door. I thought I imagined it, but now I'm sure. And you didn't tell the police? I was afraid. What if she saw me? What if she thinks I'll talk? Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on hers. You've done the right thing now. And what matters most is the truth. It always finds its way through, like water under a locked door. Angela looked at her with wide, tear-bright eyes. "Do you think she did it?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the lace is beginning to unravel." By Friday morning, Lower Chiddingfold had grown quieter, not in peace, but in that heavy stillness that settles over a place when something is about to shift. The bells from St. Winifred's rang a little slower in the air, and the usual cheerful hammering of the blacksmith's apprentice across the green had ceased altogether. The village, it seemed, was holding its breath. Miss Marple rose early. Her breakfast was modest, and her expression thoughtful as she read over a letter from her nephew Raymond. His literary ambitions, though endearing, offered little distraction this morning. Too much remained unresolved. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in the drawer beside her writing desk, and turned her mind to the lace. Specifically, the fragment she had found, the mantilla it must have come from, and the confirmation provided by the torn magazine clipping tucked in Mrs. Draper's handbag. There was a path here, not entirely clear, but it was there. Someone had lied about more than lace. At 9:10, a sharp knock rattled the front door. It was Joan, her niece, cheeks pale and eyes urgent. "Aunt Jane." "There's been another incident. At the cottage." Miss Marple set down her embroidery. "What sort of incident?" "She was found in the garden," Joan whispered. "Señora de la Fuente. She's alive, but unconscious. The housekeepers. Boy found her when delivering eggs. Dr. Dewberry's already there." Miss Marple stood. "Come, child, let's walk." The way to Briar Cottage was short, but in the span of those few minutes Miss Marple noted several details. The absence of birdsong, the drawn faces peering from curtains, the constable posted near the front gate, the scent of rosemary from the garden mingling uneasily with something acrid, like overturned earth and rust. They were admitted by the doctor himself, who met them just inside the doorway. "She's stable," he said at once. "But it was a close call. Ingested something. Likely sedative in nature. Not enough to kill, but certainly to knock her unconscious." "Suicide?" Joan asked hesitantly. Dr. Dewberry shook his head. "Hard to say. There was a broken teacup beside her. No note, no sign of forced entry." Miss Marple stepped quietly past them into the parlour. The room was dimly lit, the fire burned low, and a glass vase had been overturned on the side table, its flowers drooping like exhausted dancers. On the floor lay a delicate black lace mantilla draped loosely over the edge of an ottoman. Miss Marple moved toward it and gently picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, the pattern as intricate as the one in the magazine clipping. She turned it over in her hands, careful not to snag it. A thread was missing. She checked the corner. There on the inner hem, a tear. Just the size of the piece she had found between the paving stones in her own garden. She folded it and placed it gently on the armrest. Her expression did not change, but inside her mind things were beginning to settle like dust in a beam of light. Back in the hallway, Inspector Graves had arrived, flanked by Sergeant Little. "I was already on my way when word came," Graves said. "A second incident is rarely coincidence. You were here." "I came at once," Miss Marple replied. "My niece told me." "Did she say anything before collapsing? Leave a letter?" "Not to my knowledge," said the doctor. "She was already unconscious when they found her." Graves turned to Little. "Send for the chemist. I want that teacup tested. And check the doors. See if anything's been tampered with." Little vanished down the corridor. Graves turned back to Miss Marple. "You've spent time with her. Any sense of despair?" "She's private, not despondent," Miss Marple said quietly, "and quite meticulous. I find it difficult to believe she would break a teacup by accident or leave lace strewn about." Graves frowned. "You think someone meant her harm?" Miss Marple paused. "Or meant to frighten her, silence her, or stage a scene meant to look like something it wasn't?" He stared at her. "You believe she's involved in the Draper case?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that someone else believes she's dangerous." Graves looked unconvinced, but he made a note. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the Draper house once more. Mrs. Betts, now more welcoming, let her into the front sitting room. "I remembered something," the housekeeper said. "The day Mrs. Draper died, she asked me to fetch an envelope from the bureau. Said it was marked coronation lace. I found it on the second shelf." She tucked it into her handbag. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "And this envelope, is it missing now?" "I haven't seen it since, but I remember she handled it like it was precious." "Did she ever mention a letter?" "She said she had proof someone lied. Said she'd bring it to the guild meeting, but she never made it that far, did she?" Miss Marple thanked her and made her way back through the village, her thoughts turning inward once more. 2 events, 2 women, 1 dead, 1 silenced. The common thread was not lace, it was reputation. Someone feared exposure. And Miss Marple suspected that Señora de la Fuente, for all her elegance and silence, might not be the schemer after all. That evening, as twilight dipped the rooftops into shadow, Miss Marple sat by her window watching the lamps flicker to life across the green. Her fingers were still, her knitting untouched. Somewhere in the tangle of lies and misunderstandings, a truth had taken root, but it had not yet bloomed. Not fully, not until the 3rd thread revealed itself. By Saturday morning, a hush had fallen over Lower Chiddingfold that no church bell could dispel. News of Señora de la Fuente's collapse had spread as quickly and quietly as mist on a meadow, and though the police offered no official statement, everyone in the village believed the mystery had reached its peak. A poisoning, an attempted second, some whispered suicide, others speculated revenge, and some, Miss Marple among them, knew it was neither the beginning nor the end, but merely the tightening of a knot. Seated in her drawing-room, Miss Marple reviewed the facts not with charts or diagrams, but with the same method she used to solve a tangled skein of yarn. Patient hands, a clear memory, and attention to where the threads crossed. There were 3 central knots. 1. Mrs. Draper, poisoned. After hinting she held evidence of deception. 2. The mantilla, the broken lace, the missing catalogue page. And 3. Señora de la Fuente found unconscious, the timing suspicious, the scene too deliberate to be dismissed as accident or despair. But the clue Miss Marple kept returning to was not lace or letters. It was a person, Angela Crowthorne, not as suspect, but as key. Late that afternoon, she asked Joan to bring Angela for tea. No pretext, no pressure, just a quiet gathering in the conservatory, where the light slanted in golden ribbons and the smell of warm gingerbread softened the air. Angela arrived hesitantly, shoulders drawn in, eyes flitting to every shadow. "I don't want to talk about her," she said as she sat, About Senora de la Fuente or Mrs. Draper or any of it. You don't have to, said Miss Marple gently. But sometimes, when one's been silent too long, the burden grows heavier than it need be. Angela looked down at her hands. Joan poured the tea and excused herself, leaving the two alone. You saw someone in the house that day, didn't you? Miss Marple asked quietly. Angela's hands tightened around her cup. I told you. I thought I saw her. Just the mantilla. But now you're not certain. A long pause, then, no, I'm not. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. What if I told you that the lace fragment found in the garden does not match the tear in Senora de la Fuente's mantilla? Angela blinked. Then someone else wore one. Perhaps only for a moment. Perhaps only to create a shadow at the right time. A silhouette in the corner of your vision. Angela stared at her. You think someone meant me to believe it was her? Miss Marple nodded. And they succeeded, didn't they? Enough to make you doubt what you saw. To keep you quiet. Angela set her cup down with trembling fingers. But who would do that? Miss Marple didn't answer at once. She rose and crossed the room to a small cabinet. From within it, she drew out a folded piece of cloth, the lace fragment. Angela took it, held it to the light. This isn't the same as hers. No, said Miss Marple. It matches another piece I saw once, on a certain costume, worn at a village fete some years ago. It's not Spanish, it's Nottingham lace, machine-made. Angela frowned. But who? At that moment Joan returned with the post. Among the envelopes was one marked in heavy blue ink. Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside was the laboratory. Report Graves had promised to send. The substance found in the teacup beside Senora de la Fuente had been chloral hydrate, a sedative. Not cyanide, not lethal, but enough to induce sleep within minutes. A staged collapse, then, or an attempt. To frighten, Miss Marple folded the paper and turned back to Angela. My dear, I must ask something of you. It's rather delicate. Angela nodded. Tomorrow, when the village gathers for Sunday service, I'd like you to mention, casually but within earshot, that you've remembered seeing someone else enter the vicarage that afternoon. Not Senora de la Fuente. Someone else entirely. Angela's eyes widened. But that's not true. I don't mean to accuse, said Miss Marple. Only to observe. Someone will react. Strongly. In a way they won't mean to. And that reaction, my dear, will give us what we need. Angela hesitated, then slowly she nodded. The next morning the village assembled in the pews of St. Winifred's under leaded glass and incense. The vicar's sermon was subdued, as was the congregation's mood. As people filed out, Angela spoke to her friend near the lich gate, her voice low but deliberately audible. I've remembered something odd, she said. I think I saw Mrs. Edgewater going into the house just before it all happened. It couldn't have been Senora de la Fuente. The lace was too thick, and the shoes too English. A pause followed. Several nearby heads turned. Mrs. Rosalind Edgewater, who had been pretending not to listen, went still. Her gloved hands clenched, and she dropped her handbag. A small packet slipped out, paper wrapped and string-tied. Angela bent to retrieve it. But Miss Marple was already there. Allow me, she said gently. She handed it to Graves, who had lingered nearby at Miss Marple's suggestion. He opened the package. Inside was a bundle of folded lace, and tucked within a torn piece of magazine, identical in type to the one found in Mrs. Draper's handbag. The caption beneath the lace read, Nottingham pattern, mass-produced. 1912. Miss Marple turned to Rosalind. Doris Draper discovered the lace wasn't real, didn't she? And she threatened to tell everyone, including the committee of the Women's Guild, where you've proudly passed yourself off as an expert in Spanish textiles. Rosalind's face paled. She was going to ruin me. Years of reputation gone over one swatch of thread. You'd hope to frame Señora de la Fuente, Miss Marple said. The foreigner, the obvious suspect, a mantilla, a broken teacup, a fainting spell, all very theatrical. Rosalind said nothing, but her hands trembled. Graves stepped forward. Mrs. Edgewater, I'll need you to come with me. As they walked away, Miss Marple turned to Angela, who was still frozen in place. You were very brave, she said softly, and very kind. Angela looked at her. You knew all along, didn't you? Miss Marple smiled gently. Not all along. Only after I began to see the seams in the pattern. The following day, a Monday washed in cool September light, the village of Lower Chiddingfold returned, at least outwardly, to its gentle rhythms. The clink of milk bottles returned to doorsteps, the smith resumed his slow hammering, and the grocer's bell jangled on cue with each new customer. But a new awareness lingered beneath the surface, a quiet understanding that something dark had threaded its way through their quaint streets and garden hedgerows. Rosalind Edgewater was no longer seen walking briskly past the greengrocer or holding court at the post office window. She had been escorted to the county station late Sunday evening, not in handcuffs, but with the dignity she so carefully cultivated, dignity now stretched thin over a fabric of deceit. Inspector Graves had followed procedure, and Miss Marple, as always, had stayed behind, the centre of calm in the swirl of resolution. At the vicarage, over a modest tea of seed cake and apple slices, the Reverend Crowthorne offered a prayer for clarity and peace. Angela Crowthorne had joined them, her face pale but her voice steady. Miss Marple was there too, seated comfortably by the hearth, her knitting in her lap, but untouched. I still can't quite believe it, the vicar said. Rosalind. A murderess, Miss Marple nodded slowly. It's always those we least suspect, or rather, those we suspect for all the wrong reasons. Rosalind was known for her sharpness, yes, but her reputation mattered more than anything. And Doris Draper's discovery threatened the very foundation of that. Angela stared into her tea. She went to all that trouble, just to protect a lie? A small lie can become a great burden when it's worn too long, Miss Marple replied. Rosalind had built an entire social identity around her supposed expertise in antique lace, her membership in regional societies, her role in the Women's Guild. Her status depended on it. And Señora de la Fuente? Angela asked softly. She was the perfect scapegoat, said Miss Marple. Foreign, elegant, mysterious, someone no one truly knew. Rosalind planted the idea from the very first tea party, criticizing the mantilla, drawing attention to its theatricality. She wanted people to watch Isabella, not her. But how did she do it? The vicar asked. The tea, I mean. Miss Marple turned her eyes toward the window. Rosalind arrived early to the vicarage on the day of the murder. She offered to help set the table while the vicar took a call in his study. That was when she arranged the cups. She laced just one, the vicar whispered. Yes, the second from the right. But Mrs. Draper almost chose another, until Rosalind made a remark about that particular cup being her favourite. A small nudge, nothing overt. Angela blinked. So, she manipulated even that. And she had prepared the cyanide beforehand, lightly hidden in a sugar sachet she discarded later. Mrs. Draper drank the tea and the poison worked swiftly. But it had all been timed with such precision that it appeared random or even opportunistic. The vicar closed his eyes. It's chilling. Worse still, Miss Marple continued gently, Rosalind later staged Senora de la Fuente's collapse to complete the picture. She laced a cup with chloral hydrate, sedative, not deadly, and slipped it into the garden during a delivery. She knew Isabella would find it, being a creature of habit. She watched from a distance as the woman collapsed. But why sedative, not poison? Asked Angela. She didn't want another death, just enough to frighten her into retreat. Rosalind assumed that once Isabella was discredited publicly, or too shaken to speak, the suspicions would fade with her. The room fell into silence. Then the vicar, his voice low, asked, "And the mantilla?" Miss Marple gave a slight smile. Rosalind owned a similar lace shawl. She wore it once to the village fete several years ago. She retrieved it from storage, cut a small piece and left it in the garden, knowing it would eventually be found. The aim was to confuse the eye, to plant a visual echo of Isabella's style in the right place at the right time. Angela looked down at her hands. She made me believe it. She wanted you to, Miss Marple said kindly. She counted on your hesitation and your silence. Outside, the wind brushed through the apple tree. Its leaves danced a little in the early autumn breeze, scattering a few yellowing petals onto the vicarage path. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the village. She passed Briar Cottage, where the shutters had been opened once more, and a new lace curtain now framed the front window. A faint smell of orange blossom trailed from the garden. Senora de la Fuente was seated there, knitting with graceful patience. Miss Marple paused at the gate. "I hope you'll consider staying," she said softly. Isabella looked up. "I am not sure. My name has been whispered too many times. Whispers fade. Truth lingers longer." Isabella held her gaze. "You did not doubt me." "Not for long," Miss Marple said. "There was sorrow in your silence, not malice." The two women stood in quiet recognition of one another for a moment longer, before Miss Marple turned and continued down the lane. That evening she returned home and resumed her knitting, the piece she had abandoned when the first cup of tea shattered, the piece of the village. Her fingers moved easily now, as though the mystery had simply been a knot worked out with time and care. She thought of Doris Draper, a woman whose sharp opinions had led her too close to someone else's carefully maintained illusion. She thought of Angela, whose youth had been tested, and of Isabella, whose dignity had endured the storm. And she thought, not without some irony, that in all her years of quiet watching, it was lace, of all things, that had finally unraveled the murderer. Not science, not confession, just thread and human pride. She placed her knitting aside and reached for her tea. The cup was simple, white porcelain with a rose at the bottom. No favourites, no arrangements, no second from the right. Just tea and peace. For now. Sunday gave way to Monday, and by Tuesday, The village of Lower Chiddingfold had begun to shed its tension like mist before morning sun. Though the shadows of what had occurred remained in quiet corners, in hushed tones at the draper's counter, in the deliberate avoidance of a few key names, the daily rituals of village life were stubbornly resilient. The baker's shelves were filled once again with cinnamon buns by 8:30. The grocer had a new shipment of tinned peaches, and at St. Winifred's the choir resumed rehearsal for the autumn harvest service, with Miss Chudley hitting sour notes in full volume, as if the recent murder had never happened. But not all had returned to normal, and Miss Marple, ever attuned to the ripples beneath still water, could sense it. On her morning walk, she paused by the village green. Mrs. Betts, the draper housekeeper, was sitting on a bench near the war memorial, knitting with determined concentration and stiff posture. Miss Marple greeted her warmly. "They've begun clearing out Mrs. Draper's things," said Mrs. Betts without looking up. "Solicitor came yesterday, said she left no will more recent than 48. "That doesn't surprise me," Miss Marple replied. "Doris was traditional in many ways, orderly but not sentimental." Mrs. Betts gave a grunt. "She kept things she never looked at. I opened a drawer yesterday full of pressed flowers and old letters, all tied in pink ribbon, not touched for 20 years. "We all have our keepsakes," said Miss Marple, "even those who seem above them." "She had more than people knew," the housekeeper said softly. "I always thought she was hard, but when I looked through her papers, I saw things that made me—" Pause. Miss Marple nodded with understanding. "Sometimes people protect themselves with sharpness like porcupines, but inside there may still be softness." Mrs. Betts looked at her then, her eyes watery but not weak. "Did she deserve— What happened to her?" "No one deserves murder," Miss Marple said gently, "but she deserved to be understood, even if too late." She left the housekeeper to her knitting and continued toward the post office. Inside, a new dynamic was taking shape. Miss Lavinia Crane, freshly humbled by recent events, no longer spoke quite so confidently about her neighbor's failings. Instead, she now listened more than she gossiped, her voice quieter, her conclusions less hurried. She offered Miss Marple a brief, almost apologetic smile as she purchased a book of stamps. "Angela sent in her resignation to the guild," Lavinia said in a whisper, "but we refused to accept it. We told her that strength like hers deserves to stay." "That was kind," said Miss Marple. "It was right," Lavinia replied, then hesitated. "We all listened too little. Let Rosalind do the talking for too long." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Well, Lavinia, if self-reflection is spreading in Lower Chiddingfold, that's quite the event in itself." She stepped back into the lane, where the autumn wind was teasing the turning leaves from the trees. They fluttered down like slow confessions, one by one. In the days that followed, changes continued. Mrs. Edgewater's house was shuttered. Her belongings, neat as ever, were inventoried and carted away to an undisclosed location by a private firm. The lace samples she had once proudly displayed at the Guildhall were removed without ceremony, replaced by books on embroidery contributed by Miss Talbot, a retired art teacher who'd spent 3 years in Bruges. As for Senora de la Fuente, her decision came quietly. One morning her shutters were closed, and a sign appeared in the window, "Let by private agreement." It was Miss Marple, and Miss Marple alone, who received a final letter before the widow's departure. It was hand-delivered, tied with a red ribbon, and written in a fine looping script. Dearest Miss Marple, I shall not remain in England. Not because I do not love its hills, its hedgerows, and its quiet strength, but because I believe the heart cannot settle where it has been so questioned. You were the only one who looked at me and did not see a mystery to be solved, but a person to be understood. That is a rare gift. I thank you for it. The mantilla, my grandmother's work, is enclosed. I leave it not as evidence, but as remembrance. If you ever travel to Andalusia, you shall find in me a most devoted hostess. Yours. With respect and gratitude, Isabella de la Fuente. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it gently inside her keepsake drawer, beside a pressed rose and an embroidered handkerchief once given to her by a girl in Devon in 1919. Then she unfolded the mantilla, draped it over the back of her reading chair, and stepped back to study it. The lace caught the light with delicate precision, woven not of lies but of lineage and time. That afternoon she had Joan and Angela over for tea. The mood was lighter now, the silence no longer tense but reflective. I still can't quite believe how easily we were misled, Joan said, buttering a scone. We weren't misled, said Angela. We just didn't know how to see clearly. Not at first. Miss Marple always sees, Joan said with a small smile. Miss Marple gave a modest shake of her head. Oh, I observe. But I'm not immune to being wrong. I simply try to keep my mind uncluttered by certainty. Angela tilted her head. So do you ever truly know, or do you just wait until people reveal themselves? Miss Marple sipped her tea. It's a bit of both. People always show their truths in time. You just have to recognize the moment when they stop pretending. Outside, dusk crept over the hedges. The golden light grew softer, casting lace-like shadows through the sitting room. In the hearth, a low fire crackled. The cat curled against the skirting board. The village had quieted again, but not forgotten, and Miss Marple, serene in her high-backed chair, let her needles resume their gentle clicking. Another mystery was behind her, another pattern completed, and all that remained was the quiet satisfaction of truth, subtle, certain, and stitched into place. 2 weeks had passed since the truth unraveled beneath the soft lace and sharpened smiles of lower Chiddingfold. Autumn had deepened. The air had grown cooler, and the scent of wood smoke clung to the cottages like a shawl wrapped gently around tired shoulders. Life resumed its course with careful grace, but the memory of what had happened, of Mrs. Draper's death, Senora de la Fuente's accusation, and Rosalind Edgewater's fall from grace, remained like the shadow of a stitch long pulled through velvet. Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window early one morning, the first frost silvering the grass below. The sky was a faint pink at the edges, promising a clear, cold day. In her lap lay her embroidery hoop. She wasn't working yet, merely tracing the pattern with her eyes, thinking. At her side, the folded mantilla rested on the windowsill. She had kept it near since the widow's departure. She did not wear it, of course, it was not hers to wear, but she could not bring herself to tuck it away entirely. It seemed to speak of something important, not merely the case, nor even the solution, but the deeper thread that ran through it all, pride, vulnerability, the intricate need for dignity that so many, especially women of a certain age, carried, like fragile glass. She heard the clock downstairs chime 7:30. Soon it would be time to start the kettle, But for now she allowed herself the stillness. She had begun thinking of Mrs. Draper differently. In the days immediately following her death, the villagers had remembered her as many things: overbearing, vain, quick to judgment. But as time passed and the harshness softened, new details emerged in conversations, half-remembered moments that revealed a different texture. She had once paid for a local girl's piano lessons, though never spoken of it. She had made jam each autumn and left jars anonymously at the door of the infirmary. She had, in her own way, cared deeply about the structures of the village, its boundaries, its moral compass. Yes, she had done harm in that name, but she had also believed, perhaps too rigidly in order, Rosalind Edgewater, by contrast, had been so concerned with perception that she allowed illusion to become her reality. Her obsession with status had eclipsed judgment, and when it was threatened, she had acted not out of desperation, but out of cold preservation. It was not the lace that damned her, it was the fear of being unmasked. Miss Marple considered this, quietly, sipping her tea once it arrived. In the downstairs parlour, Joan had begun sweeping. The warmth of domestic rhythm comforted her, not because it erased tragedy, but because it framed it. Even the darkest crimes must find their place within the ordinary. That was how people endured. Later that day she ventured out. The village green was empty, save for a few children throwing leaves into the air with wild laughter. She stopped by the churchyard, where the last of the dahlias bowed their heads toward the earth, their time nearly done. She paused at the Draper stone, simple, newly inscribed. Doris Eleanor Draper, widow, citizen and friend, 1872, 1954. Friend. Miss Marple let the word settle. Someone had insisted on that. Perhaps Lavinia, perhaps even Angela. There was grace in its inclusion. She wandered next to the edge of the village, where the hedgerows grew thicker and the road began to rise toward the woods. She did not often walk this far, but today it felt necessary. Solitude and fresh air had a way of clearing the dust from mental corners. There was a bench nestled beneath a beech tree, its bark worn smooth where children had once carved their initials. She sat there and removed a small notepad from her handbag. She did not take many notes in the traditional sense, but sometimes she jotted impressions, turns of phrase, mannerisms, odd contradictions. She wrote a single line. Fear dresses itself in many costumes. She tapped her pen lightly against the paper. In Rosalind's case, fear had worn the lace of a Spanish widow. In Angela's, the guilt of silence. In Doris Draper's, the rigid mask of morality. And what about Isabella? She had carried fear, too, Miss Marple realized. Not of guilt, but of being judged, of not belonging, of standing always slightly apart. That perhaps had been the greatest cruelty of the entire affair, that an outsider had nearly been destroyed by the projections of others, and yet, in the end, the truth had prevailed, not through confrontation or drama, but through quiet observation, through noticing the wrong thread, the hesitation at a teacup, the way someone glanced too often at a handbag they pretended not to notice. Human nature, Miss Marple believed, was rarely malevolent in its essence, but it was prone to self-preservation. And pride, when wounded, could become more dangerous than a loaded pistol. As the sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the treetops, she rose and turned back toward the village. She walked slowly, her hands gloved, her scarf fluttering gently at her collar. There would be more harvest gatherings soon, a winter bazaar, then carols and the New Year's luncheon at the parish hall. Life did not pause for long, not even in the wake of murder. It simply folded the event into its story, added a chapter and moved forward. Back at her cottage, she prepared supper, onion tart and a small pot of stewed apples, and set the radio to the evening news. She listened to the announcer read headlines from London, and though the names and scandals were different, she recognized the same pattern beneath them. People in conflict with themselves. Before bed, she returned once more to the mantilla. She smoothed it across the back of the reading chair and regarded it not as evidence but as testimony, not of guilt, but of heritage, complexity, and the way beauty could be mistaken for artifice. She hoped that wherever Isabella had gone, she found kindness, a place where she did not have to prove herself with every glance and every word. Miss Marple turned off the lamp and stepped into the quiet of her room. The day was done, the mystery settled, but the lessons, as always, lingered. In a world where facts might be tampered with and motives twisted, she trusted one truth above all. If you want to know who someone is, watch them in the moments when they think no one is watching. And when you do, you may not only solve the mystery, you may understand the soul behind it.